this is going to pick back up after the election. Of course, they're just doing it for purely political reasons.
My name is Mike Mauceli, and this is the Energy Show with REI Energy, where we're energizing your investments and maximizing your tax deductions. Today, we're going to be talking about energy predictions in 2024, and you're going to discover how for oil and gas is projected to grow in 2024 and beyond and reward investors. My guest today is David Blackmon. David's a 40-year veteran of the energy industry. David has 25 years experience in public policy analysis, management, and strategic communication space. And I think it's a great time to talk about, some of your articles that you've written. And I think a lot of our listeners, everybody wants to know what's going to happen, with oil prices. I mean, of course, the Biden administration, they've had a war on fossil fuels, and, it seems that everything they've done has just caused prices to go higher. So I wanted to kind of get your thoughts, on to dive right into it here.
Yeah, the plans aren't quite working out the way they had hoped they would.
Yeah. Yeah, I saw today that they're only going to, I think, have a lease sale in the offshore Gulf of Mexico for 3 leases this year. So, they've kind of done everything they can thrown everything they can throw at it. And I'm not sure their EV mandate is making it.
Right. And the only reason they're doing that tiny offshore lease sales because they've basically been forced to do it by the courts.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that probably makes a lot of sense. As minimum as possible. So can you explain the increased demand for oil and gas, that you write about in a lot of your articles?
Sure. In fact, I was just discussing that with another fellow this morning. We just have, when you look at the landscape of how our society is now evolving, we have enormous demand for energy being caused by emerging technologies and growing technologies like electric vehicles. Elon Musk famously told reporters a couple of years ago that we're going to have to double generation capacity on our energy grid just to account for charging all the electric vehicles Joe Biden wants to be sold in this country over the next 10 years. Now we have Sam, what's his name, the CEO of the big AI company saying, well, you know what, we're going to have to double capacity on the grid just to accommodate AI too. And then we have all the Bitcoin mining and the server farms for all that. That is creating enormous demands on the power grid. And so we're in a situation now with the population continuing to grow, India's and China's economies continuing to emerge in a huge way. We're going to need more from all sources of energy. And I'm not one who says, well, you just got to get rid of all that wind and solar and focus on fossil fuels and nuclear. We're going to need more of all of it. And what we need to do with the renewables is be smart in how they use them. But yeah, we're going to need more oil and gas. And just the day we're recording this, OPEC came out with another forecast, a very strong demand for this year and next year and into the future. And everyone I talk to, in high positions in the oil and gas business agrees with that forecast.
So OPEC Plus, they've been pretty committed to, cutting production when they need to, and of course raising it when I guess they're trying to keep that price level at somewhere between around $80 and $100 a barrel. Do they actually still control the price of oil around the world?
It's getting harder and harder for them to do that. Even at OPEC Plus, which controls about 40% of global production as a group, because the United States has grown its own production. We increased production in the United States by 1 million barrels per day last year, even as the rig count, the count of active drilling rigs fell by 23%.
Wow.
And that's because we're just, these companies are getting smarter and smarter about how they drill and complete the wells, and they're able to recover more and more production from each well that gets drilled. And so, in the United States, we're growing our own domestic production so rapidly, even in this administration that's been trying to impede the growth of the industry. That's how creative and dynamic the oil and gas business is. And then you have the growth in Guyana. where ExxonMobil and Chevron and CNOOC, that partnership, are going to be producing 1 million barrels of oil per day in that tiny country's offshore by 2027. And other emerging provinces around the world, it's just becoming more and more difficult for the OPEC plus countries to really control things.
Well, even, with them obviously keeping production down, prices have pretty much remained in the $70-$75 range for West Texas Intermediate. And of course,
Yeah.
Brent crude sells for about 80-85, somewhere in that price range. Do you see prices continuing to stay at that level throughout this year?
Yeah, I mean, and I think that when you talk to people at the big companies in the industry, we're kind of at a sweet spot right now with the current price for oil at around 75, 76 WTI and 81, $82 Brent. That's at a level where, number one, the companies are making enough money and raising enough capital, generating enough cash flow to continue drilling enough wells to maintain and even increase production gradually. It's a price that doesn't create such high gas prices that people are feeling a lot of pain at the pump right now. We're not at $5 regular gas like we were a couple of years ago. We're at three and a quarter, $3, something like that. And so everyone can live with prices where they are right now. And it has seemed to me over the past several months that really when you pay attention to the OPEC plus monthly meetings and what is said out of those, it seems that cartel is also kind of working to try to maintain the price at this, around this current level, because big price spikes are not good for anybody, and big price busts are not good for anybody.
Right.
I mean, when the price drops and gas prices go down to $2, consumers think, oh, this is wonderful. But at the end of the day, all that does is set you up for the next big spike in prices. And because you create shortages of supply, and ultimately demand's going to come back, and the price is going to shoot up again. So you really don't want either one. And these OPEC countries also like having prices at a fairly robust, stable level so that they can predict, what's going to happen into the future and plan their own economies, because most of them are command and control economies with a national oil company. And if you have the relative stability we've had over the past 6 months, everybody's happier about it.
Yeah, no, I've often said that, prices at $100 a barrel, you really see a lot of pushback from the
Yeah.
from the population at that point, because you go to the pumps and it costs you $120 to fill
Right.
up your car. It doesn't help anybody. So,
And then the politicians feel the need to get involved, right?
right.
And start doing crazy things like draining the Strategic Petroleum Reserve.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm still waiting to find out what Biden's going to do this year
Oh my
since we
gosh.
got an election coming up, on how he's going to drive oil prices down again.
I really worry about it because it's already at such a low level, and there's all these hot spots in the world now. It's kind of dangerous to be doing any more of that.
Yeah, I think one thing that a lot of people don't realize, when we're drilling these horizontal wells, which that's probably 80% of where most wells are getting drilled today. I mean, that it actually cost about $35 to $40 a barrel, just in your, what we call a lifting cost, what it costs to produce a barrel of oil.
Yeah.
So it's not cheap. So when they think these oil companies are making all this money, they're really not. I mean, as far as that, I mean, during the good times, obviously they do, but as I said, it's not a big profit margin there
Right.
anyway.
Right.
And but I wanted to kind of get your opinion on the LNG, that Biden has now come out and going to put a hold on the one new LNG plant that's going to be built. I mean, how is that going to affect, the natural gas prices?
Well, it's a so if you believe the administration's talking, this is a 10-month delay in the progress of permitting with the federal agencies. Okay. And so if you believe that, and if you assume that The process is going to pick back up after the election. Of course, they're just doing it for purely political reasons. Then you can think, well, maybe this won't be such a major negative impact on the domestic industry as it tries to expand to meet global demand. But number one, I don't believe they have any plans to reactivate the permitting process after the election. I think that this would become a permanent thing if they get reelected. That's the first thing. The second thing is this is extremely damaging to the credibility of the United States as a trading partner because it disrupts the predictability of how the laws in this country are going to be enforced. And, it makes it very difficult for companies that want to be in that business to plan. These are 10, $15 billion projects we're talking about here. And it can take years to source the capital and get to a final investment decision on a project like this. Not months, not weeks, years. And so now you have this delay in permitting on projects that, have already sourced most, if not all, of their capital financing. And the investors in those projects are now sitting there thinking, well, wait a minute. I probably got better places to park this money now than sitting here waiting on, the assumption that the Biden administration is going to resume permitting after the election. And a lot of that capital is going to flee the United States now that would have otherwise been invested here. It's going to go to projects all over the world because, someone who's planning to invest $2 or $3 billion in LNG can do that in Algeria. They can do it in Qatar. They can do it in Australia and other exporting countries. So it's just a bad precedent for any administration to set, to just disrupt the legal process here in the United States. And it just does so much damage to predictability that it's going to be hard to recover that.
Well, especially when you have countries like Germany and, the Eastern European countries, now they have put a blockade on any gas coming out of Russia. I guess they're not buying gas from Russia anymore. So the only reason behind LNG, of course, is to export it, across the world. As far as that. So, is it, that going to create, like you were saying, isn't that going to create a problem for us in the future for competition from places like Australia that's a big LNG exporter?
Right. It's going to create a huge problem. And another of the main beneficiaries is going to be Russia because of this decision by the Biden administration. Sometime in the next few months, what you're going to see is the pipelines coming from Russia through Ukraine into Western Europe that have been, they ceased all flow through those pipelines last year because of the war. What you're going to see is the gas is going to start flowing again through those pipelines into Europe. And that's going to cut deeply into the potential market for the U.S. LNG industry in Europe. And so who's the main beneficiary of that? Vladimir Putin and Russia.
Yeah.
So it's so counterproductive on so many levels that it's just really sad that they felt the need to do it.
So to get back to oil for a second, I've always heard that one of the biggest reasons why oil prices are high is because of the refining capability here in the United States. Is that true or?
Well, so, I'm not really sure the refining capacity really has that big an impact in the United States because so much new refining has been built now in China and other parts of the world. What it does impact, though, the inability to build new refineries in the U.S. is it's created this mismatch in how our refineries are set up, and between that and the production now from the shale plays, because we're producing all this light sweet crude, very light crude grades of crude oil now from the Permian Basin, Eagle Ford, Bakken Shale, on and on. Most of that's having to be exported because our refineries were built to process heavy grades of crude with lots of impurities in them, sulfur and other impurities coming in that are produced in places like Venezuela and Brazil and and the Middle East. And so you have this, this dynamic that's been created because of that mismatch between the refining assets and the production coming out of the shale basins, to where now the United States, for 2 solid years, pretty much every month for 2 years now, we've been a net exporter of crude oil in the United States. Last month, we exported an average of more than 2 million barrels a day, more than we imported into the United States. So it's it does create some, and that could have some impact on price globally. But the thing is that the price is set on a global market, and if it does have an impact, it's a pretty small one, I think.
So we use about what 13 million barrels of oil a day in the United States, and we use about 22 million barrels a day. I think we produce about 13 million barrels a day here in the U.S. and
of crude oil, but then we also produce a lot of condensate and natural gas liquid. So if you add all that up, we're producing almost as much as we're using.
So why does this administration feel the need to bring oil in from Venezuela and these places that
that whole dynamic with Venezuela is mind-boggling to me. We stopped, lifted the sanctions last year on a regime that is one of the most brutal bad actors in the whole hemisphere, purely because the Biden administration made a calculation it might drop the price of gas at the pump by a nickel or a dime. That's really weird. And then you look at California, which claims to be this big green place that's so concerned about emissions. Well, most of the oil being used in California today is coming in from Venezuela, which is very dirty, very heavy crude oil with a ton of impurities in it. Where California has all these untapped resources of its own that it could be producing instead of importing from Venezuela. And so it's just one of these hypocritical situations that, again, creates a lot of displacement in the markets and distortions in the market that really don't need to exist.
Yeah. And that doesn't include, of course, the diesel that it takes to ship it over here in
Right.
ships,
Yeah.
or
all
in
the
all
emissions in
the
the ship.
or all the environmentally sensitive reefs they have to go over in order to
Right.
get it to a place in California where it's supposedly environmentally friendly.
Right, exactly. And a lot of what comes into California too is not even crude oil, but refined gasoline, a Venezuelan crude that was refined either in Venezuela or other countries, on the route up to California from Venezuela, countries in Central and Central America and Mexico that have much laxer emission standards than we have in the United States. And whereas if California was producing its own crude oil and having it refined there at refineries owned by Chevron and Phillips 66 and others in California with its heavy environmental standards, the net savings in emissions would be enormous. But
Yeah.
you have all these restrictions on production in California, so they can't do that.
Didn't California at one time, wasn't they like the second or first largest producing state of oil and gas?
Oh yeah, for a long time, yeah, and just huge oil fields in the southern part of the state, and now of course, in the central and imperial valleys, in the center of the state is really where the remaining reserves are, and they're huge reserves, but it's so hard to get permits to do anything with it that not many companies are trying anymore.
Yeah, you would think that a lot of the voters there would, want to produce their own oil because obviously it would make it cheaper to live there.
Yeah, yeah. If they were educated at all about the situation, yeah, many probably would. But I mean, the school system doesn't teach anybody about that, and the news media never reports on it. So you know, most people have no idea about any of it.
Yeah. I wanted to kind of get your thoughts on the wind industry. I know here in Texas, I guess we're probably one of the largest wind states in the country,
Yeah,
and then of course, but more recently, I mean, the Biden administration, they've been pushing this offshore wind, and of course, I've read a lot about it where these companies are all trying to back out of their contracts now because it's just not economical, or they're wanting more subsidies from the government.
Right.
I don't know, as far as that. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, it's both. I mean, Ørsted and BP and Equinor are three of the big developers up in the Northeast, the offshore wind up there, and they entered into these supply agreements. So when you plan a big offshore project, you first thing you do, you got to plan your project and your capital to develop it. But then the next step is to negotiate supply agreements with utilities onshore and states, whether with the state or the utilities themselves. And those agreements commit you to provide electricity for certain maximum rates that will be charged to the consumers. Well, those first wave of big projects that got permitted out there, those contracts were negotiated 3 years ago when interest rates were near zero, and we didn't have all the disruptions in the supply chains that we have now. And so the economics of those projects looked entirely different than they look today. And so what we saw last fall was Ørsted and BP and Ecuador canceling projects and taking huge multi-billion-dollar write-downs on their assets. And now, so you just had another round of bidding on new projects that was conducted by the federal government in January, and those same companies bid in to obtain the permits to develop new projects. So but what they'll do now is renegotiate higher rates for their obligation to supply power onshore. And so what happens? Well, who bears the cost of that is the consumers, and it hits the poorest consumers the hardest because it's essentially a regressive tax on their income. And because everybody has to have, we have to have electricity. We can't live without electricity. And if these states are going to mandate certain percentage of it be supplied by offshore wind, well, that's going to be the most expensive energy electricity that consumers can obtain. It's most costly on the margin now, and the least efficient as well. So it's really a bad idea from all aspects.
Yeah, we just renegotiated our contracts for our office building, and I think we usually do them on 5-year terms, and natural gas prices are very favorable right now.
Right.
But even being favorable, the prices have gone up significantly. And when I was asking our the group that we buy our electricity from, they all say it's because of the green energy push, that so much of it. And that's one of the main reasons why we're seeing these higher utility bills, is to subsidize, stuff that doesn't actually work.
Right. Yeah. It's hit us hard in Texas too. But, so for example, my bill here at the house is based on 11-cent charge per kilowatt. In San Diego, they're paying 45 cents. Okay. And San Diego is a lot cheaper than Germany. I mean, so we're in Texas, even though it's high. I mean, just a few years ago, my contract with the utility was for 8 cents. And even before that, 6.5 cents. So it's gone up very substantially because of all the new wind and solar coming onto the grid, and the charges that these utilities have to charge in order to account for all that intermittent power that they're supplying. So it's a real cost to everyone, and that's an intentional part of the energy transition. The people pushing all this want your utility bills to be higher. They want energy to become increasingly costly to force everyone to conserve, because they know that wind and solar cannot adequately replace fossil fuels and nuclear energy in the power generation space. So, forcing people to use less energy is a big part of it.
Why don't we build more nuclear plants here in the U.S.?
Well, the nuclear industry, and I've interviewed a lot of people about that over the recent months. It unfortunately, and I think if you're ever going to approach anything resembling net zero, you're going to have a major renaissance in nuclear, first of all. But unfortunately, from a PR standpoint, they're still stuck in 1979 after the 3 Mile Island incident, and the China Syndrome movie came out a week after that happened. And they've never recovered from that from a
Hmm.
public relations standpoint. And the federal government's permitting processes are really kind of based, on the assumption that you're going to still be permitting old generation technology that really hasn't even existed for 20 years. Nobody's been building, and we're developing all this new generation of technologies that are so much safer and more effective and wildly lower cost than wind and solar. I mean, dramatically, if you would ever build it to scale. Um, but the federal government, hasn't, modernized its permitting processes in 30 years because no one's been trying to build it. And so we're in a bad spot in the United States, but you compare it to country like France and even Great Britain now, which is really focusing on building a lot of new nuclear. We're so far behind the curve in the United States, it's really shocking. And I'm hoping whoever ends up becoming the next president will bring in people at the Department of Energy that will really focus on that.
Maybe they ought to start by changing the name and not name it after a bomb, and maybe people will get more
Yeah,
friendly to it.
yeah. It's just, yeah, just call it fusion energy or
Yeah,
fission
or
energy.
green energy.
Yeah, and because it's zero carbon, folks. I mean,
Yeah,
the only carbon emissions involved in nuclear energy are in the building of the plant, right? And you're going to have emissions, obviously, from all the concrete and making of the steel and everything you have to do to get the plant built. But once it's up and running, it's zero emissions.
yeah, and it's pretty cheap. I mean, as far as the electricity that it generates, I
Oh
mean,
my God. Yeah, it's so much cheaper than what you're going to get on the margins with wind and solar. It's no comparison.
yeah. So, the administration, not only have they canned, the LNG plants, of course, now they're trying to come after your gas stoves and your hot water heaters and your ceiling fans and
Yeah.
everything that we, enjoy. I mean, as far as that, and, I mean, is that stuff actually gaining any traction or not? I wouldn't think it would be.
Well, I mean, they've put out new efficiency standards at the Department of Energy that are going to make it pretty much impossible and eliminate about 6% of current gas stove models from the market. And they're doing the same thing with water heaters and your air conditioning units. They're going to make a big push. If Biden gets reelected, they'll make a big push to force you to replace your air conditioning units with um,
Heat pumps.
heat pumps,
Well, I
which
have
make
one of
them
those, and I can tell you it is the biggest piece of crap that I've ever
right.
seen.
Yeah. Oh, and they're having horrible experiences with it in the UK and in Germany. It's just a disaster everywhere it gets tried, and yet all these governments seem intent on, trying to take everyone there. Um, if Biden doesn't get reelected, if it's a Trump administration, it'll be a big difference, at least for 4 years. But then as soon as you elect another Democrat, you're going to go right down the same road again. So in the United States, because of the fact that we keep going back and forth between the parties in the White House,
Yeah.
it's going to be an ebb and flow on this stuff for the foreseeable future. And it
You know, it,
becomes so hard to unwind all this stuff once they've put it into regulations and statutes. It becomes very, very difficult to get it unwound.
yeah, and I heard, the Secretary of Energy, Granholm, she was saying that obviously they're developing all this new technology that are going to make these appliances so much more efficient. But, I look back at my dishwasher, right? When Obama passed that law where you could only use so many gallons. I mean, you pretty much have to wash your dishes before you put them in the dishwasher if you want them clean. So you're probably using
Right.
twice as much water as you were before,
Exactly.
or you having to
Exactly.
run it twice.
Right. It's the same thing with the low flush toilets, right? The low water use toilets where you you end up having to flush your toilet 2 or 3 times
Yeah.
instead of just once. And okay. Um,
It-
yeah,
I, I,
another thing they're doing that people are not aware of, we have an enormous shortage of transformers for the grid, high capacity transformers that are an integral part of any expansion of the grid or transmission system. It's taking 4 years to source transformers today. We make almost none of them in the United States. They have to come from overseas. And the Department of Energy, in the midst of this supply chain and supply crisis that is really creating a very unstable situation on our grid right now, they're also doing new efficiency standards for transformers, which currently operate at 99.6% efficiency. So, and what they're pushing is going to require all the makers of transformers who want to sell in the United States, they're going to have to completely retool their manufacturing centers to be able to sell into the United States. This is insane. It's absolute insanity what they're doing at DOE on transformers, and nobody's really aware of that because other than the power generators themselves, no one wants to talk about it.
yeah. And of course, that's their way of getting around, a lot of the, you know, pushback that they get is just to do it, the permitting wise or the environmental standards
Yeah.
that they put on all of these, developers or these manufacturers. And and of course you don't read about that in the news. Obviously, it just you don't know it until it happens, right?
Right. It's because it's a story you can't tell in 25 words or less, is I made obvious just then. It's a complicated story and people's eyes are going to glaze over and not read about it. So, newspapers and TV stations don't want to report about it.
So you say solar outperforms wind. How is that?
Solar is much more versatile. Um, with wind, the only innovation you can do with wind energy is to make the towers taller and the blades longer and kill more birds. With solar, you can put solar anywhere. They've developed these flexible solar panels now that you can wrap around utility poles and still generate electricity from them.
Hmm.
Every big box store in America is a prime spot to, to put a solar roof on top of. You can put it on your homes, although unfortunately the way home solar has been marketed, we found has been kind of a scam. But
Yeah.
it just is so much more versatile. You can put solar right there too in the market, right in Dallas Fort Worth on the tops of these big box stores, whereas wind farms are being built out in West Texas, way down in South Texas, and you got to build 300-400 mile long transmission lines to get the electricity to market. And so it's just a much more versatile and effective product all around.
Yeah, I agree with you. The home solar has been marketed incorrectly, and it is a lot of it is a big scam. And I
Yeah.
looked into it for my home, and in the end, I just decided it wasn't going to work for me. I mean, as far as that, and I
Yeah, we did the same thing in the wake of Winter Storm Uri. We got bids from 4 different companies and found every one of the bids to be a complete scam and decided, that's enough of that.
so I read lately that I guess the grid here in Texas, we're going to start selling electricity to, I think, Mississippi and Alabama, or is Louisiana? Is that? I mean, I'm
Yeah,
assuming it's expanding that direction, right?
I and I don't know if that's a good idea or not, quite honestly. After Uri came through and we had the big freeze, and the blackouts, this false narrative arose claiming that, well, if only in Texas had been, hooked into all these other grids in next neighboring states, everything would have been fine. Well, nonsense. Those states were frozen too.
Yeah.
Okay. We weren't going to be able to buy any electricity from Louisiana or Oklahoma or New Mexico because they were all blacked out too. But now ERCOT has decided, oh well, we need to interconnect and share resources, and we already have an unstable grid, and the grids we're connecting into are also unstable. So I don't understand how that's going to really help anything. And I would say, well, but the people of ERCOT have done such a wonderful job and know so much better than we do. We'll just take their word for it. But then again, Uri kind of disproved that theory, right? And so I don't know who to trust and who to think is right about all that.
Well, I certainly appreciate having you on the show today. It's been fun talking to you. And
Always a pleasure.
I guess the big question is what do you think oil prices are going to do this year?
I hope they're going to remain pretty stable, quite honestly. The only thing that would make them drop dramatically would be a global recession that destroys demand. And or Saudi Arabia suddenly deciding to flood the market. That's the other potentiality. But I don't think the kingdom has any real incentive to do that. So I'm hoping they're just going to kind of hover in this same area. I don't really see Brent going above 90 at any point, and West Texas Intermediate going much above 80 at any point. I think we're going to have a pretty steady year.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see what the administration's going to come up with to try to drive them down before
God help us.
Well, can you tell our listeners how to follow you, David?
The easiest thing to do there, it's pretty simple. Just go to Substack. I repost everything I write at Substack. It's Blackmon, BLACKMON.substack.com. And you can go from there to find me at every other place I write. Also on Twitter, my handle on Twitter has nothing to do with my name. My handle is @EnergyAbsurdity because that's mainly what I write about on Substack. So
great. Well, I want to have you back in the future before the election gets on so we can see where prices are then.
Yeah, would love to do that. It'd be fun to see how wrong or right I've been today.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
This podcast is a presentation of Rich Dad Media Network.